Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Renée Richards has become the source of international and national controversy over the past week or two. A cause celeb. The reason? Is she male or is she female?
She is a transsexual. 2 years ago, she was Dr. Richard Raskind and was ranked nationally among the top 20 male tennis players over age 35.
It's just overpowering all the other stories. How many transsexuals were in the world at the time? And it just so happens one of them is a professional tennis player. It's like, what are the odds, you know?
I said to her, what do you call yourself? Transgender, transsexual?
I'm a woman like everyone else. Ask me how the match went instead.
Like, how in the world did this happen? This might incentivize more guys to turn into girls or something.
Should she be allowed to play against women opponents?
It was big news, it was sensational. She beat somebody who said afterwards it wasn't fair, I was playing a guy, Her next opponent walked off the court, wouldn't even finish the match.
Some of the lesser players were getting all up in arms and they almost on a strike mode.
I think that what they are afraid of is the unknown.
Her size, 6'1", and her skill have threatened other female players.
What if she comes on and becomes number one? Are we all going to be able to handle that?
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hi, hello, and welcome to the proceedings, my friends. This is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I welcome you to this week's proceedings. Thank you for joining us. Well, I can't set up the topic more clearly than this. That was from 2011, an ESPN Films /30 for 30 documentary, simply entitled Renée. And I think by most accounts, people will know that we're going to be discussing the story of one Renée Richards, a fascinating and enigmatic character from sports' past, especially in the 1970s, when she literally came out of the blue, seemingly, to take the tennis world and by extension, the sports world, and by further extension, society by storm. A very memorable set of events. You could hear that in the voices of people in that clip like Howard Cosell and Virginia Wade, Bud Collins, the tennis commentator, John McEnroe with a take there, Mary Carrillo, another commentator of note, Martina Navratilova, who plays a role in the story of Renée Richards, which we'll find out a little bit in a few minutes. And of course, Billie Jean King, the pioneer in terms of women's rights and equality, not only in tennis, but in pro sports, all thrust in the midst of, frankly, at the time, I think, depending on where you were coming from, a somewhat bizarre kind of story of a male transitioning into female for a whole sector, swath of American and world society. It was a shocking and or unexpected kind of phenomenon. And all of a sudden, you had a pretty decent tennis player, at least previously as a male amateur, when Renée Richards was known as Dick Raskind, essentially somewhat surreptitiously in the beginning, and we'll find out in a second as to how and why that happened, and then literally out in the open, competing in the women's circuit. And as you can imagine, that stirred up a huge range of emotions from positive to blisteringly negative, and various curiosities of take in between. This is the complex story of the most enigmatic figure, I think, of 1970s sports. And we are honored to have Julie Kliegman here this week, who has an excellent new book out. It is coming out, I think, tomorrow as we record this. So this episode will be dropping on the 17th of August. I believe the book comes out in its entirety on the 18th. So depending on when you're listening to this, it's either available for pre-order or it is out now. And I highly recommend it. It is published by HarperCollins. And it's not the newest. Well, it is the newest take on this story. It's not certainly the first. Renée Richards has had, I think, 2 biographies, if I'm not mistaken. One, I think maybe they're both autobiographies. I forget. There was a TV movie in 1986 that somewhat dramatized her story. And of course, the documentary I just referenced. But this is a topic that seems to be having yet another moment in our society, heavily politically charged. And no matter where you stand sort of on the idea of trans rights and all these kinds of things, it is still undeniably intriguing about where and what this story of Renée Richards fits in certainly 1970s tennis, sports in general at this time, as well as what has transpired both in the sports world and sociologically in general today. Some of the themes, some of the issues, some of the raw takes and or misunderstandings of what's involved certainly continue to make this an issue that is a hot button topic for many. I think even clouded by a surprising take from Renée Richards herself now, almost 92. I think she's 91 years old now, retired mostly from her 40-plus year ophthalmology practice in Manhattan, well-regarded physician and ophthalmologist. That's what she and previously in her previous life as Dick Raskin, medical school and ophthalmology. That was really the career. Tennis was, for a short period of time, also the career, but that's what she went back to after all of this was over. But I think it's very important to kind of sort of understand what was going on around this time, how this story came to be, how Renée Richards came to be, and interestingly, why she isn't necessarily excited to kind of be sort of labeled as a pioneer or any of that kind of stuff. And certainly some of the takes that she has about her life and what it has meant to various people is not necessarily the full embrace of, allowing transitioned women to play, say, in professional women's sports. And that's interesting. That's not a take that you would automatically sort of expect from somebody who has lived the life, so to speak. And that's what we're going to kind of get into with Julie, because this book is as complicated and as confounding and as intriguing as the subject matter itself. And while I will probably dance incorrectly with a pronoun or two along the way, please forgive me in that, but I am just fascinated by all of this, if not for the societal issues that it reminds us of today, but frankly, just as a sports story in the 1970s, you could not avoid this story if you wanted to. And I think over time, you get a better sense of sort of putting things in perspective and maybe perhaps different acceptance and or points of view about what her life was all about and perhaps what she was going through, as well as how people react to it, good, bad, and indifferent. All right, I'm not going to fumfer too much further here. This is a wonderful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I highly encourage you, again, to get a copy of this book because it will disavow you of uncertainties, and it will certainly be a bit more factually certain about things, and it'll probably put your framing of what you think you remember the story to be on firmer ground. Again, it is called Finding Renée Richards, the groundbreaking story of tennis's trans pioneer. It's by our guest this week, Julie Kliegman. It is published by HarperCollins, and it is available either tomorrow or now, depending on how you're listening to this show. And let's get to our chat now. Here it is, me and Julie. Please, as always, enjoy. I think our audience is probably of a certain age, right, where they remember the story of Renée Richards in the 1970s, largely when all of the storylines were playing out. Obviously, the story predates that. We'll get into that, and exists still today in her. I don't know if she's still practicing as an ophthalmologist, but
she's not.
She's not. Okay. But before we get there, how about some background on you? And then importantly, how this story hits your radar enough to write this, I think, quite extraordinary book.
Yeah, so my background is as a sports journalist. I worked for The Ringer and then for Sports Illustrated for many years. And I started covering trans athletes when I worked at Sports Illustrated because it was 2020 and that's when those state bans started coming into play. And I wanted more context about how we've talked about how we've treated trans athletes in this country. And, you know, there aren't that many examples to look to. And Renée Richards is the primary one.
That's a very interesting point, and important point too, right? Especially considering as we record this, and I guess we'll round up our conversation with this, but I guess you could probably also set the tone with it too, right? I mean, there are, certain political winds that are blowing, right? That are almost the antithesis of what this story is about, right? And it's almost uncaring of better understanding what not only Renée Richards has gone through, but what the whole story, the pioneering nature of it, and frankly, just the whole nature of trans in our culture and our society and stuff, right? And the ease by which it can be overly or quickly politicized.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what then informs you as you go into researching the background of Renée Richards, and what do you know going into the story? And frankly, what do you not know or think you know?
Oh, there was so much I didn't know. I am in my 30s, so I was not alive for her 15 minutes of fame, as it were. All I knew was that there was a trans tennis player a long time ago. So I was really coming in pretty fresh, to be honest with you. I had made the assumption that she stood behind her lawsuit, which turned out to be very incorrect. I'm sure we'll get into that. But I looked to her books at first. She's written some books herself, namely 2 memoirs, Second Serve and No Way Renee. And those were a great starting point.
Interesting. So bring those to the fore, because those are essentially, I don't know, how could you say, sort of authorized, were they authorized biographies or autobiography or?
Yeah.
And when did they came out too?
Okay. So she wrote them with another writer. So it's in the first person. Second Serve came out, I believe, in 1983, and No Way Renee came out in 2007.
So given that, one could interpret that as being, I've said all I need to say.
Right. Or
there's another chapter I just haven't gotten around to essentially writing there. How much was she helpful in this pursuit, or were you trying to do this completely independent of Renée Richards and maybe then connect with her afterwards, or maybe not at all? What's your methodology?
I reached out to her at the beginning of the process because I knew it was a good book idea either way, but I also knew that having access to the primary subject's actual thoughts and memories, and by extension, her network of people's thoughts and memories, would be a huge advantage. So it's not an authorized biography, what I wrote, but she does participate in it without having any say over it, which is a hugely generous thing of her to do, and I'm very lucky. So yeah, I wanted to talk to her as much as possible, and I did. I interviewed her many, many times.
So when you set the tone for the story, right? It's really interesting, and this is something that I did not know either, or maybe I didn't know just generally, maybe not either. That before transitioning, Renée Richards was a men's singles player in the 1950s of, I would say, some renown, a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of that origin story, perhaps, of what was prior to all this, because I think even in the 1970s, I don't think people just sort of locked in on the story and then sort of realized that, this is somebody who actually had some level of ambition on the court.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, she didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, it seems that way because people were new to her name. I mean, she was new to her name at the time, but she does have this long backstory, as you said, of playing men's tennis. When I refer to her pre-transition, she likes that I use her former name and he, him pronouns. So I'll say she was playing tennis as Dick Raskind. That's her birth name. And Dick was a pretty good tennis player. He was an amateur. He was ranked as high as like 6 in the Eastern circuit at one point. And yeah, I mean, he had started playing tennis when he was 10 or 11 and won his first championship shortly thereafter as a boy. And so this was really a lifelong interest of Renée's.
And a smart guy he was too, right? He was at the Horace Mann School, which is an elite school in New York, and went on to Yale University, and obviously became went to medical school thereafter. But a talented athlete. Didn't Dick even have some level of baseball competency and or interest?
Yeah, at Horace Mann, he played baseball, and he says he was scouted by the Yankees. So I never got anyone, funnily enough, that could confirm that story, but I don't say that to cast doubt on it. But yeah, Renée says that Dick had some talent as a pitcher, and I think that's true if you look back at the clips of Horace Mann games from the day.
Also served in the Navy and played there too, and did quite well to the extent that the competition was there too. So this is sort of it sounds to me that this is very sort of classic, upper middle class, Northeastern elite school bred kind of world, right? Where, the career is definitely not to become necessarily a pro tennis player per se, but an activity of substance and skill that was probably more than just a supplement to one's quote unquote true career.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I think Dick Raskind was a really well-rounded person, as Renée is today. And yeah, I think extracurriculars were a huge part of that. It wasn't just like a passing casual hobby. It was something that Dick and then Renée took really seriously.
So I guess the real sort of intrigue, I think, in all of this story, and we want to encourage people to buy the book and sort of understand this sort of, and there's been at least one documentary, at least the 30 for 30 and stuff. So there's certain aspects of this story that have been or are out there, but I think it's intriguing to understand a little bit of the pathway to this, because clearly Dick Raskin was exhibiting certain types of behavior and social approaches, right? That, I guess in hindsight were maybe a little obvious, but a thing like this, a transition gender transition, right, it's not a lighthearted thing, right? This is something that has how does, I guess the real question in there as I'm fumbling through it is how does this start to manifest from what you could tell in your research and to a point where it goes from not central to truly endemic, right? Enough where surgical approaches are investigated.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's different for every trans person, of course. And for Renee, she became interested in wearing girls' clothing at a very young age. So this was kind of like deeply seated in her. And I think it was always kind of a serious thing for her. You know, she would go and dress up as a woman as a teenager and, you know, walk around in New York City and Manhattan. And she would engage in some self-harm around that activity too. And so I think it was always, she always talks about it and writes about this battle between Dick and Renee, with Renee kind of bubbling up inside her. And there were certain days or certain months or certain years when Dick was a stronger force than Renee. But overall, I mean, the way she puts it, like Renee was just overpowering. And like, that's why surgical interventions, hormonal interventions, that's why these things became necessary for her, because she just kind of, she would try and go through a lot of like psychoanalysis too, to try to like quiet this portion of herself. And it just didn't work. I mean, she certainly gave living as a man her best effort, and it wasn't for her.
Yeah, and I don't want to gloss over it, right? Because you also have to put this in sort of in a time capsule, right? Because he at the time growing up and having gone to college in the, I guess it was the late 1950s, right? So early 1960s, right? Struggling with this, whatever this was considered to be back then, right? Is with probably not a lot of support and or if you will, role models or others that have that could be confided in, understand. Am I the only one thinking this way? Is this the thing, right? I mean, that has just got to be mind-boggling, let alone to be able to, I guess, to play competitive tennis and pursue a career in medicine.
Right.
This takes up a lot of psychic and mental energy.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was like all consuming on top of everything else you just listed. I mean, it's real big challenge, and it is today, but back then it was orders of magnitude more difficult, I think, because people didn't even know what to call this. Was it transvestite? Are you a transsexual? Like, there was a lot of confusion over those terms, and there were few people to look to. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people at the time knew about Christine Jorgensen, who was a former Army GI who ended up transitioning to becoming a woman and became like a performer of sorts. But she was really the only prominent example in the US around that time. And, Renee briefly attended a support group for other transsexual people, as she was going through all this uncertainty and this push-pull of Dick and Renee. But that ended up, in a way, leaving her feeling more alienated because she felt like she couldn't really relate to the other people she was meeting up with.
Yeah, the story of Christine Jorgensen is very interesting. It's a bit tangential to this because it's not sports related per se, but for some strange reason, I went down a rabbit hole the other day watching some old episodes of talk shows, in particular Jack Parr, the night he left or took a 3-week sabbatical, shall we say, from his late night show. And he actually was defending himself for the joke that he had told the night before, and he was all upset, and he had yet to walk off the air. But he had mentioned that there were people who he didn't want to bring on the show because he wanted to keep it light and entertaining and all that kind of stuff. And then he mentions this Christine Jorgensen by name. It's like, it's not, yeah, exactly. Right. And it's like, okay, well, I think I vaguely remember the name, but then when you go through all this, but you're right. I think Christine Jorgensen was probably, for anybody who was even paying attention in the 70s, and this again, she was after transitioning, when she was popular, I guess, in the early to mid 1960s, right? That's really the only kind of comparison, if you will, even if that people could even. So, plus the fact that Dick Raskin gets married in the early 70s, just a whole bouillabaisse of just got to be incredibly impossible to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's something that even, in Dick's personal life, this came as a surprise to his friends and his family for the most part. It's a really big secret to keep for a really long time. And that goes back to your question of like, how did this become endemic? And I think it's harboring this part of yourself that's so private for so long. It must be extraordinarily painful.
Okay. How about tell me where the tennis is at this point, right? Dick Raskin has gotten married. I think it's an early or the mid 1970, I think. They have a son. He and his wife have a son in 1972. They're divorced roughly 75 or so.
Yeah.
Where is and all the backstory that we kind of just, scratched the surface of. Where is the tennis in all of this at this point in this juncture in his life?
Yeah, I mean, he's competing at like the US Open 35 and over types of tournaments. And
strictly
really
as an amateur, correct?
Correct, yeah. And that was normal for the time too. It was before the Open era, so a lot of great tennis players never went pro. Not that he necessarily would have anyway, but yeah, tennis is there. It's kind of taken a back seat to his growing ophthalmology renowned. But it's there. Tennis is what helps him get through the divorce and the struggles of parenting as a divorced father. And yeah, he's competing regularly for sure. So tennis is like the biggest through line of Renee's whole life.
That's very interesting. And that's something that really didn't come out until I kind of read your stuff here, is that this wasn't just a story of a professional tennis player or a tennis player that might have an eye towards professionalism or at least competitive and the gender the transitioning of such, right? It's almost like this is you said through line, right? It's almost, I wouldn't call it a crutch, but it was certainly it's something, it's a passion, right? That, and a skill that becomes almost like comforting in some respects.
Absolutely. I think that's the right way to put it for sure.
Where then does the intention become a pathway and made more manifest, a plan, if you will? What kind of triggers or signals or becomes kind of I want to say point of no return, but a confidence, I guess, that going through actual transitioning would be the correct path and all that comes with it, right? Because I'm sure that was a decision not only that did not come lightly, but probably bounced around in different versions in then his head.
Right. I think what really triggers the transition is his divorce from his wife. Because at that point, I mean, he has a kid, so it's not like there's nobody left to pretend for, but it is like a huge weight off his shoulders, I think, that he no longer has to keep up like the husband and wife appearances, as it were. So the transition that had sort of started and was on and off and on and off for all these years really speeds up after the divorce.
And at this time, right, he's also establishing. Is he an established ophthalmologist at this point, or where was his, if you will, his day job career at that stage?
Yeah, by now he was an established ophthalmologist.
So in that, then, any competition that he was playing in tennis wise, right, was still of this high level amateur. Was it open competition at this point yet? I mean, was he on anybody's radar as a competitor, as a male in these tournaments at that point?
I mean, he had played with like he was known to like Bobby Riggs and people like that. Like he was pretty known in like men's tennis circles. So he wasn't like routinely like crushing the competition or anything like that, but he was doing well and he was a known quantity.
But after the transition, right, the competition, walk us through from what you learned and the veracity around it about how those first matches after transitioning occurs, right? And how does she now go into those? How much? I mean, because it was not publicly known at the time, right? We'll get to the story of the, if you will, the outing of it. But applying to and playing in some of these tournaments locally and regionally, now as a woman, right? Was it immediately sort of discovered that there was something unique about this new Renée Richards, or was it kind of, I don't know, held back in terms of discovery?
Once Renée made the leap to start playing outside of her club in some of these tournaments, discovery happened pretty quickly. I think aside from the La Jolla one, which is where we'll get to where she was outed, I think she played some matches at a university near her club as part of some like, I don't know if scrimmage is the right word, but some other sort of amateur event. So La Jolla was really the biggest risk she took to that point, and it very quickly became clear she was not going to stay under the radar.
Yeah. So explain this. This is an open match. This is part of the USTA or the WT. What's the framing of this this open? I think right that she was competing in.
Yeah. So it's the La Jolla Tennis Championships, and that's in San Diego. It is, I believe, a USTA affiliated event. It's now the longest running, I believe, amateur tennis tournament, which is just a fun fact. So she goes down to San Diego and stays with some friends there, and she writes to them in advance like, hey, I'm Renée now. Don't worry about it. I'm the same person. Like, please be quiet about it. But what happens is, the name Renée Richards was kind of unknown, right? So that sparks some curiosity, like who just showed up on the scene. And also she was really good. So naturally that starts drawing attention too. I mean, she goes on to win this tournament.
So she was not necessarily forthcoming per se, or she was?
She entered the tournament under the name Renée Clark.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think she was kind of trying to throw
Figure
another...
out.
Yeah. I think she was wanting to be known, but also wanting to stay unknown. It was a hard place for her to be in. And she was, she also gave her age as 10 years younger, and I asked her why she did that and she couldn't remember. So so the entry into the tournament was not an entirely truthful identity, but she played in these games. She was pretty dominant, and all the while she gets word that there are like rumors going around about who she might be. And then that's when this local news reporter for a TV station, Richard Carlson, who is in fact the father of the conservative pundit Tucker Carlson, He starts looking into this. He finds her medical licenses, some of which are under the name Richard Raskind. And after the tournament, she gets a call from him and then multiple calls from him like, hey, I'm going to expose this on my news broadcast. So it really all comes together pretty quickly.
Carlson at the time is a newscaster in San Diego. I think he had been in Los Angeles prior to that. And here's a fun fact. I worked at the Voice of America when I was in college.
Oh, wow.
During the time that he ran the organization then. And that's
no way.
Because it was kind of not great from that perspective. But I digress. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of sidebar for sure. So the timing of this, I'm going to sort of put all this in perspective, right? So this is the transition to Renee is basically around 1975 or so.
Yeah.
Competition is in 1976. Is that right?
That is right. July 1976.
Okay. And so besides then, and I'm just curious from your reporting and your understanding of the story, how do you think now Renee, had thought through all of this in terms of being discovered, so to speak, right? I mean, because the name change, of course, she dominates a tournament kind of out of the blue, right? That happened. There's no previous competitions. I'm sure sort of I mean, she told some friends or it said it won't be a big deal. How much of her personality, her psychology, is either getting in the way or shielding her from the realities that are likely to play out eventually?
Yeah, I think part of her had to have known that playing it in this La Jolla tournament was too big a risk, but she is a really, really, really driven person. I mean, it's that Horace Mann and Yale background, right? So I think she was really determined to play tennis no matter the cost. And she wanted what she wanted. And I think she maybe was in a little bit of denial that it would be suspicious looking from an outsider's perspective. But definitely part of her wanted to be known and part of her really didn't.
Okay, so explain that dichotomy to me, especially when her identity is revealed and the story behind it starts to come out. How much does she at this point, do you think she understood or how much was fueled by a desire to take this to some other levels? Or was this just her trying to play and be competitive and enjoy the sport that now she was good at? I mean, did she kind of recognize that there would have to be legal proceedings and fighting and stuff to kind of make her case? I mean, she wasn't an activist / pioneer at this point, was she? Or was that in the back of her mind eventually, do you think?
It was definitely not in her mind at this moment. She really, truly wanted to play tennis, and I don't think she started thinking about a professional opportunity until, honestly, journalists started asking her if she planned to play in the Open and things like that. I mean, after her press conference, which followed Richard Carlson's outing, she held a press conference at her tennis club, kind of like clearing the air and saying that she was a transsexual woman and all that. She had a really big choice to make. She could go back to her ophthalmology practice in California, or she could try her hand at pursuing the whole tennis thing. And I think it was at that point that she maybe had a little bit of activism on her mind, but not really before that, no.
Well, but a little bit of, if I could sort of call it this, sort of celebrity capital, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, maybe by design, maybe not. I don't know their psychological, frame of mind at that point. But I mean, you kind of hinted at before that she didn't necessarily mind the attention, but now with this attention, right? Like, well, I, would Dick Raskin ever considered even going sort of pro? I mean, at the time, he/she, they were in their 30s, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough time to start a pro career, no?
Right. I mean, I think there's a world in which Dick Raskin would have pursued tennis instead of pursuing a career in medicine. But that just wasn't the way things were done in the Raskind household. It was expected that Renee, then Dick, would become a doctor, take after the father, David. So, just kind of like shirking off responsibilities and obligations in that realm to play tennis would not have really flown per se in the family. So I think it was on his mind as an option, but not like a real option, if that makes sense.
And again, there's no personality or person or there's not a whole lot to sort of rely on in terms of other people who've gone through this path, whatever, right? So there's a bit of, I want to say making it up as you go along kind of thing, but there's certainly a lot of uncertainty, confusion, literally and figuratively confusion. Tell me what I think we kind of know, but maybe you can kind of crystallize it. What was the tennis world's reaction to this reporting and the press conference and stuff? Were there new rules or tightening of rules, or what was the immediate response in reaction?
I think at first there was shock. And then, what the US Open did when they heard about this was they kind of clamped down and said, like, oh, now we're going to require every woman to submit to a cheek swab test for, that would indicate like their chromosomes essentially, or their likely chromosomal makeup, which had never been the case before in professional tennis. They had not sex tested all the women before. So this was very clearly targeted at Renee Richards. And yeah, they were sort of panicked, I think, about this news and didn't know what to do. Just as there was no playbook for Renee, there was no playbook for tennis officials either. So they were kind of working on the fly to figure out how can we keep Renee out of the tournament and out of the professional circuit. So they instituted this sex test, and Renee did not want to partake in it initially. So she sat out the Open in 76.
Why did she not want to participate in that from what you can tell?
Well, I think one reason is she knew she wasn't likely to pass the test, not being born a woman. And I think another reason was she recognized it as like targeted discrimination and was upset about that. So while she wanted to play, I think she figured she could play in some unsanctioned tournaments and gain experience that way. And, which is what she ends up doing over, like the fall and winter and spring into 1977.
I think it's also important to, and maybe you can help frame this a little bit for our audience who is new to the story, if you can believe it. I mean, people of a certain age think this is not a new story, but they're probably
right.
God bless them. They're younger than we are. Me. So, put into context this story more broadly as this story breaks, because I think you even quote this in the book. There's a whole bunch of reporting and stuff. There's a Sports Illustrated column, I forgot who wrote it, who was observing that there were so many different reactions to her that sort of were against an entire range of emotions, from astonishment to resentment to sympathy to suspicion to, just confused, like, what is this trans thing? The whole story.
Yeah.
Right. So can you put that into context? Because this was a major story / spectacle, so to speak, beyond just the little, small little world of high amateur tennis and a little old competition. We're playing in the U.S. Open.
Right. This really was a spectacle. And I think not only did everyone in the tennis world kind of take a side or a stand, whether they were believing Renee should play or whether they were outraged that she was attempting to play, it was really something everyone in the public started weighing in on. Like, you see, there are letters to the editor in all these magazines and newspapers about their own personal thoughts on, I think someone compared it to like keeping baseball segregated or, racially, I mean, things like that. So, and there were also people who were like, Renee is not a woman, she's a man masquerading as a woman. So you saw like the opinions really ran the gamut and everyone had one.
And it's also quaint, though, I think, by comparison. I'm sure you were struck by this as you were putting pen to paper or typing in whatever. When you compare to the hyper politicized world we live in now, right, where it seems that at least on certain side of the aisles, it's politics first and everything is framed through that, right? But back in the 70s, right, it was, I wouldn't say the politics was more quaint, but certainly society was in this regard, right? But you certainly heard and saw elements of reactionary hatred and vitriol and outrage, right? But then again, you also saw, the 1970s was certainly a time when the 1970 was Stonewall, and you had a lot of the gay dynamic was becoming much more accepted and understood. The disco music thing, the culture was certainly evolving and changing and stuff, right? So there was also probably a hefty amount of understanding and celebration, bravery of this, whether she wanted to be perceived as brave or not.
Right.
I got to think at that time, and again, I was 9-10 years old at the time, right? But just the range of emotions, I wonder what she thought was going to happen, and was she going to expect all this sort of, I don't know, bouillabaisse of emotions out there?
Yeah.
But I guess she had to be heartened by a whole swath of folk who were behind her in her corner and probably expecting that there was going to be a whole bunch of people who didn't understand.
Right. And I mean, she was getting letters from people in the queer community, from other marginalized groups, just applauding her and supporting her and cheering her on. And so she had all that support. She also had the knowledge that, like, in her own personal life, everyone supported her. She didn't lose family members. There were rocky moments with some members of her family, but she didn't lose family or friends over this. I mean, so I think it goes back in a way to Renee's willpower and her drive to be accepted and be successful. And so she knew there were people against her. There were plenty of people against her, but you're right in that it wasn't quite the same politically charged, hostile climate it is today. It was, because again, as we said, a lot of people didn't have any concept of like what a trans person was or who they were or, why they were like that. I mean, it was just, Renee seemed like a one-off in a way, whereas now trans people are like villainized as a group.
Yeah, there's this different level of hatred and misunderstanding and worse. So then, but she does ultimately take one of these bar tests, right?
Yeah.
Petition. And interestingly, so, okay, why does she accede to that one? And what is going through her mind at this point, even having done this test, about like, is this going to be like her life if she wants to play tennis?
Yeah, so she submitted to the test a couple of times. The first time was in Arkansas, and she submitted to that for reasons that will become clear in a second. She really wanted to pass it, and I think was determined to prove a point. So what happened was she admitted to me that she kind of did like a sleight of hand with like the slides in the testing room or whatever, and she claims she used someone else's saliva for the cheek swab and like kind of like pulled a fast one on the doctor taking the sample. So, and she passed. But there was a lot of, tennis officials, as you can imagine, were very disgruntled about this. They were very questioning of what had happened. So eventually they told her she would need to pass again.
There's years of medical training coming into play.
Right, right.
So how would you characterize that move? Arrogance, humor, deception. How would you characterize that? It's a pretty bold move to do when you're kind of trying to fight a fight of some sort.
Yeah, it was very gutsy, maybe a little misguided. It was, yeah, certainly very bold. There's humor to it now, but I think that's more in hindsight. At the time, I mean, I don't know. It's a bold play to like mislead someone on a test. So, but I get it. I get it too from the desperation point of view. Like if she really wanted to play that badly and was really wanting to do whatever it takes, I'm not saying I would have made the same choice, but I get how she got there.
Right. And you can certainly understand that. Plus the knowledge and the belief, and we'll talk about this now, that it's discriminatory and unfair in that process and stuff. So, okay. So obviously legal proceedings are necessary. Now, what I was astonished by, and I didn't know this in the story, tell me about the lawyer that winds up becoming her champion.
Yeah.
Who knows the story of this now deceased person, but relative to a person who's still alive. Let's put it that way. Tell us this story, because this was astonishing to me, given what we now know about this person.
Right. So what happened after Arkansas basically is that Renee submitted to another Barbati test, the cheek swab, and failed, and it kept her out of the Italian Open, the French, things like that. And so, yeah, it's become apparent that the legal route is the route through which she could potentially gain acceptance on the tour, because she's not going to pass that cheek swab for real. So she has some lawyer friends, and one of them recommends a certain guy. And so that's how she shows up on the doorstep of none other than Roy Cohn. And it is that Roy Cohn of, Red Scare infamy.
And he didn't hesitate. And it's interesting because we've since found out that he was a closeted gay man, yet, belied his personal composition to almost be the antagonist and almost the harshest critic of the gay community and otherwise.
Right.
It's just, the irony is it's gobsmacking.
Yes, it is. And it's kind of funny. Like, I wasn't able to uncover much of anything about why Roy Cohn was so keen on taking on this case. I don't know if it is as simple as like knowing what his closeted identity was and feeling like he should do something to help, but like that, who knows, right? Like I pulled aside at one point after I was done reporting, I pulled aside Kai Bird, who has a biography coming out of Roy Cohn this fall. And I was like, hey, any idea why, he took on Renée Richards' case? And he was like, oh, honestly, like that hadn't occurred to me. Like it didn't come up in the book and I couldn't tell you. So I felt a little better after hearing that. I was like, okay, at least there's two of us who don't know.
So that's very interesting. And I think that's among the other sort of revelations, at least to me. I mean, this is why I thought this book was just endlessly fascinating for somebody who kind of thought they knew the full story. But to tell us then how this plays out, because the legal proceedings aside start playing out in 1977 in Renée Richards' favor. And then it leads to a fairly robust competitive career later, frankly, in life.
Yeah, absolutely. So Renée is able to rally a lot of support around her for these court documents. She had a lot of affidavits, and one was from Billie Jean King, which I think was huge. What had happened was, over the previous few months, Billie Jean King had really made an effort to get to know Renee. There were all these columns in the press that's like, why isn't Billie Jean talking about the Renee Richards situation? And it's because she was still forming an opinion. And Billie Jean, of course, was the de facto leader of the women's tour. And so when she decided that she felt Renee should be able to compete, not everybody fell in line, but a lot of people on the tour and elsewhere did. So I talked to the daughter of the judge in Renee's case, and because the judge is no longer with us, and she was saying that Renee's age might have played a big role too, because as we've been talking about, she was older. At this point, she was in her early 40s, and that's not exactly peak tennis career time, right? So it's well past that. What we're used to thinking of, like when an athlete and a tennis player specifically is in their prime. So, not seeing her as maybe a huge threat who's going to beat up on all the women's stars, I think that worked in her favor. I also think like Renee looked like a woman, if we're going to get really superficial about this. She cared about the way she dressed and wore dresses, and made an effort to present herself as very ladylike. So I think all of these factors contributed, along with, some medical statements about how she was, in fact, a woman in basically every sense of the word. I think all that combined to sort of create a favorable ruling from the judge.
So Renee Richards became a professional during this point, or had she been a professional prior to transitioning, or shortly thereafter transitioning? I'm curious as to when the amateur thing became professional.
It was after she won the lawsuit. The U.S. Open was her first tournament as a professional.
Got it. Okay. And she did pretty well on the doubles circuit. She was obviously in the 35 and older kind of women's single kind of bracket and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Not uncompetitive. Certainly was competitive. How though did fellow players and the tennis establishment, how did they fall in line, and/or which way did they break, so to speak?
They almost all line up, at least publicly, on the side of inclusion of Renee. There were players here and there who protested her involvement on the professional tour. A couple who wore like t-shirts, I forget exactly what they said, but pointing out the, Renee's gender. There was one athlete who her husband / coach actually encouraged her to like leave the court in the middle of a match against Renee. But by and large, she was pretty accepted on tour, which I think is pretty remarkable.
Now, you mentioned Billie Jean King as well. Pleasure of meeting her very briefly at a preview for the documentary coming out on her for ESPN 30 for 30 in a couple of months. They don't know when it's going to come out. And obviously she's such an important figure even today when it comes to women's rights, not only in tennis, but in sports generally, being at the vanguard. Her own outing, so to speak, as being after her marriage to then Larry King, and her uncomfortably being called out as being homosexual, right? But she's walked the walk as well, right? Although albeit a bit differently in this case. But I think the one part that is fascinating to me, and you mentioned some of this too, this is probably the only time I've really seen really good in-depth reporting on this, is she actually played, Renee did, in World Team Tennis as well. What was that, because it was, if you will, the only place for her to play, or was she being generally accepted or not accepted in other pro tournaments aside from these U.S. Opens and stuff, right? I mean, was it, and I know that's a loaded question, because there was even a rift about World Team Tennis versus the WTA, right? it's a team concept and there's overlapping schedules and all that kind of stuff. I'm just curious as to how she wound up in World Team Tennis. I'm assuming Billie Jean King had something to do with it, given her involvement of starting that league, yada, yada.
Yeah, so the World Team Tennis, she was at first interested in and offered a contract by, I think, the Cleveland Nets, and that was before the lawsuit. So after Renee failed the bar body test in Italy, she was living in Europe for a little while with a friend, and she was pretty depressed about the whole tennis thing, obviously, and the state of her life. And the Cleveland Nets owner came calling and was like, "Hey, why don't you play team tennis?" So it did kind of start from this point of like, that's where she thought she would be able to play. And then she flew to the States, and something happened where World Team Tennis, I guess whoever was running the league, not Billie Jean or her husband, but I'm blanking on the person who canceled her contract. But the owner of the Nets was essentially told that was not allowed. But after Renee gained acceptance through the lawsuit in the WTA, I think that also paved the way, or at least set a precedent of inclusion. So then she did, yes, end up playing World Team Tennis in mixed doubles. Funnily enough, I think. So her partner was John Lucas, who was also a basketball player. Very talented couple of people.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you're saying that this was after the transition
Mm-hmm.
or the legal victory. She was considering or being potentially signed to play for the Nets.
It was before the legal victory that she was first being courted by the Nets, and then it wasn't until after the legal victory that she was able to actually play team tennis.
That's very interesting. Now, she didn't play that much.
No.
Matches. Matter of fact, there is a clip or two out there. Maybe we'll try to get it in the episode I guess they were I guess they were co-located at, was it St. Louis and New Orleans or something? It was.
Yeah, they bopped around a lot. Yeah.
Well, that's WTT for you.
Yes, exactly.
But there is footage of her playing and stuff, and very competitive. I forget if she won or lost the match that's on there. Okay, so let's cul-de-sac all of this then, and there's so much more detail and layers to this story, and the psychology of all of it, which she's going through, and the mania around just her as a personality and all this kind of stuff. Her career on the court, though, as a professional, only lasted 4 years. And she retired to go back to essentially her medical practice. I guess she was in New York at this time. From your storytelling, what provoked her to finally give up the tennis thing and go back to, let's say, private life, private practice, although that, of course, is impossible at this point?
Right. Money was a huge factor. She was essentially losing money in playing tennis, whereas she had been a hugely successful financially as a doctor. So I think that was one aspect. Another was just age and competitiveness. I think she had peaked a couple years earlier. I don't think she was one who just wanted to sit around and lose. Like in her last Open, I think she got knocked out again in the first round. And so I think she just knew it was time. I think she just felt it was time. And, the implications for her wallet certainly didn't, hurt either. So she went back to medicine. And then she also ends up coaching her friend Martina Navratilova.
Yeah, so explain that, the dynamic, because that's a really interesting through line to all of this too, because it shows that the impact of Renee Richards' story is beyond that just of what we've talked about, but also the sport itself is just very part of that fabric.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, she helped Martina win a bunch of slams. So Renee and Martina had started becoming friendly while they were on tour together, though they weren't like particularly close or anything. But then Renee started picking up on aspects of Martina's game that she felt could be improved, and started kind of like informally coaching her as her own career was winding down. And there was also, like we talked about with Billie Jean, Martina was also forcibly outed at the time as bisexual, and now she identifies as gay. And so I think there was a kinship there too, just like there was with Billie Jean and Renee.
So there have been a number of, I guess, writings and documentaries and there's a handful of updates, shall we say, to the story since then. You mentioned Second Serve, the autobiography. You mentioned, I mentioned obviously the documentary that was on ESPN. It was in, I think, 2011 or so.
Yeah, that's right.
And if memory serves, right, and a couple of other interviews here and there, but not a whole lot, right?
Right.
He's definitely and has remained largely a private person. What is your sense? What is your takeaway of her legacy and her perspective of that? Because from those things, certainly saw the documentary. The word ambivalence comes to my mind, but I don't know if that's the right word. And I'm sure she's conscious of how important a figure she has been on a number of different levels. But what is your take on what her contributions have been, not only to sport, but also to gay and trans rights? And where do you think her psychology sort of sits with all of this?
Yeah, it's a really good and complicated question with a very messy answer. Renee remains proud of what she did, but also feels that she shouldn't have done it, in terms of filing the lawsuit and pushing to compete in the women's tour. So she is very proud of her legacy as a tennis player, but there's this huge caveat that, like, she now doesn't think that trans girls and women, for the most part, should play girls and women's sports. And this wouldn't have come up in the documentary, really, because that was, like we said, released in 2011, which was years before this whole current wave of debate and vitriol and attack started about trans athletes.
Did you ever broach the subject with her when you did talk about perhaps using the publication of this book as maybe an opportunity to put a capstone conversationally on this story, maybe with those thoughts and understanding, especially in light of how politically charged this has become anew? It would seem to me that hearing from her with all of that perspective would be kind of a helpful and cathartic for a lot of different points of view thing.
Yeah, I don't know that we directly talked about what this book would mean to her in that sense, but I do get the impression, I mean, she had just retired from ophthalmology right before I reached out to her, or right as I was reaching out to her, basically, to start work on this book. So I think that's naturally a time where she's going to be, she has more free time and more incentive, I think, or not incentive, but more interest in contemplating her legacy. Yeah. And so I think whether or not we formally talked about this book as sort of like a capstone on her life, I mean, I do think it's fair to say it is, in a sense. And she's someone who has a lot of mixed feelings about being heard, but I do think she wants to at least be asked about her thoughts, even if she doesn't always want to be so in the public eye with her answers.
And I think that's even more important because there are plenty of other people who are outwardly or inwardly struggling with things, right? And there's certainly more tolerance and understanding of all of this that she went through on her own personally without a lot of the same, but yet there's so much amplified misunderstanding and misinformation and hatred and all that stuff too, right? So It seems that the charge in the air is even more so that somebody like this can uniquely decharge it or I think would be helpful for so many different people of all walks of life who could better hear from somebody who's kind of walked that walk and maybe be made more comfortable with still the uncertainties, even after all these years, right? Because maybe that's also part of the journey that people are going through, that there still may be uncertainties and that may never go away, even with a change or something right along the way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of what I wanted to do with this book, a large part of it, was to kind of illuminate her story for people of all ages, whether they had familiarity with it before or not, whether they thought they were interested in the whole, like, quote unquote, debate around trans athletes or not, because I do think there's a lot anyone can learn from someone who's been in her position, which is a really unique position.
And the last question I'll ask you, and then I'll let you unabashedly promote. So where do you put her, I hate to use the word, I don't know, it's a loaded word, legacy. What is her legacy? And I suspect that can be answered in a number of different ways, from tennis to sports to trans rights to human.
Right.
What do you think?
It's hard. It's a question that I asked almost everyone I interviewed. Like, what do you think her legacy is? And, there were a lot of varied answers across all those topics you just mentioned. I mean, I think she will always be the first out trans athlete to have competed professionally, and that's huge. It's not her whole legacy, but it is a sizable part of it, I think. She's also a renowned ophthalmologist, and I think she'd appreciate me mentioning that as we wrap up here. She's also just a person who, like, cares deeply about a lot of different things, both related to tennis and not. She loves the Yankees. She loves golfing. She loved her career as an ophthalmologist. She loved her son, who has passed. And, like any of us, there's so many facets to her personality and who she is. And I think more than even how she's remembered, I just hope she is remembered.
All right, there you have it. My thanks, of course, to Julie. Hope you like that World Team Tennis reference in there. I highly encourage you to go online and to YouTube in particular and find that 1978 clip of Renée Richards and her mixed doubles partner, John Lucas, tearing it up there in front of dozens in the St. Louis Checker Dome as the Sunbelt Nets, as they were known when they were not playing in New Orleans that season in 1978, having moved from Cleveland prior, were taking on the Anaheim Oranges. There's an HBO clip there. It's I think the entirety. It's like almost 2 hours long. It's great. And all its multicolored court goodness. And there's an interview with Renée in the midst of the match and stuff. It's great. And what a time capsule it is, especially with World Team Tennis coming back. Hint, hint. Yes, it's true. It's coming back, and we'll have that story for you in the months ahead. But I digress. What you need to do now is to run, not walk, and get this brand new book from our guest this week, Julie Kliegman. Depending on when you're listening to this show, it is either available tomorrow or now. It is called Finding Renée Richards, the groundbreaking story of tennis's trans pioneer. It is published by HarperCollins. That's a major publisher, my friends. And it is available wherever you get your books. Of course, we'd be honored and humbled if you decided to either click on the link in this week's show description or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com under this episode labeled 458 with myself and Julie. You can find the links to the book there, and you will be whisked away to our friends at Amazon, where we will get a couple of shekels of referral love when you decide to purchase the book in that manner. We appreciate you considering doing so. But whatever means you choose, just go get it, because you will be rewarded with perhaps the best and most modern take on this hugely intriguing story that continues to fascinate. While you're online, you can check out Julie's website and all her various appearances. She's going to be in Queens and in Brooklyn and all kinds of places and stuff. Her website is Julie Kliegman. That's Julie. Kliegman is Kliegman. Kliegman, Julie, Kliegman.com. While you're online, bookmark our site, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can buy us a cup of coffee if you like this episode. That's a little way to sort of send a little tip our way. We appreciate that. Keeps our lights on and stuff. It's a couple of pieces of merch you can purchase you might find intriguing, as well as all of the episodes that we've ever published. We put them on there too, and you can search them up and just get comfortable with all the different topics and people that we've talked to over the years. Of course, you can follow us online as well. You'll find us on the socials. We're at, on Blue Sky. You'll find us at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You will find us on X at goodseatsstill. You will find us just about everywhere else, including YouTube, where we also stream these shows for your enjoyment, at Good Seats Still Available, all one word. And, of course, our email address, if you'd like to send us one of those, a piece of email, hopefully saying thank you, or maybe not. I don't know. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And, of course, our thanks, as always, to the inimitable Jerry Payne for his audio excellence once again this week. Thank you, kind sir, and thank you for listening. So many more topics to come. Please stay tuned to your feeds. Until then, take care of yourselves. See ya.